It is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this morning. Zarqa Nawaz is a Canadian film and TV producer, published author and public speaker, journalist, and former broadcaster. In 2007, Zarqa created the internationally renowned comedy series, The Little Mosque on the Prairie, which is quite prophetic, because now on the prairies there's many little mosques. It premiered with the highest rating CBC had in over 20 years. The show went on to win a Gemini and was nominated for the Best Television Series Comedy at the 2007 Directors Guild of Canada Awards.
Notre première conférencière est une productrice canadienne pour cinéma et télévision, une autre publiée, une conférencière, une journaliste et une ancienne amatrice. Bien que nous, dans le monde de l'édition, elle restera signée des livres pour vous à la pause.
Just one more note, at the back, Zarqa's books will be for sale. And so please, and she'll sign them for you, so please think about purchasing books and a way to meet Zarqa. And so it's our extra special honor to introduce Zarqa, to share her story with us and speak. Thank you, Zarqa.
Thank you. Can I take a selfie too? That's amazing, you guys. Look. Hopefully, if my mother calls in the middle of this speech, somehow she can get past the do not disturb. I don't know how she does it. And all she wants to know is why my daughters aren't married. And why I travel the world and can't find them husbands. I'm gonna start this, can you see me or can you see you can see me, can they see the presentation? Okay. Oh, I'm gonna go back. How do I go back? Just bear with me, I'm just gonna go back. Okay, oh. Thank you for, and you know what, I have to say, are there people from Saskatchewan in the house? Were we all, how are we still standing and alive? Were you guys all on the same plane I was on that got delayed? And then by the time we landed, by the time we got here, it was like 2 a.m. And everyone's like, we'll see you guys tomorrow morning. I'm like, no, we'll see each other in 4 hours, right? And I have to say, like, I'm an insomniac. I can never really have a good night's sleep. I don't know, like I've tried everything, right? The melatonin, turning off television, blackout windows, meditating, even listening to audiobooks. The only thing that happens when I listen to audiobooks is I get caught up in the story. I'm listening to the London Seance Society. Have you guys heard about that book? It's about how to solve murders by having seances, and then apparently you can conjure the dead and they'll tell you how they were murdered. And I was like, oh, does anyone explain this to the police? We should bring that tradition back in. But the only thing that works for me, and I don't know if there's other fellow insomniacs out there, but I sleep properly maybe every 4 days after suffering from a lack of sleep deprivation, and then on the 4th day you sleep, right? Because your body can't do it anymore. And I'm like, this is perfect, like just surviving on maybe 2-3 hours of sleep by coming here. And then tonight I'm hoping I will get my 4th night of sleep because I am so tired. I really shouldn't even be standing here because if I fall, someone just catch me because I feel like, I think I'm okay. But I asked them to put this on because when I speak, I tend to be a very animated speaker and I tend to knock the microphone out. But when they asked me to speak to this group of people, I thought this is the perfect group of people to speak to because I love talking about my story, how someone like me wound up in Canada, because I am the daughter of immigrants. And people will always ask me, how did you wind up becoming a filmmaker and a television writer and a comedy writer and an author? And I'm like, the story goes all the way back to 1947. And for those of you who don't know, India used to be a single country. There was no Pakistan, there was no Bangladesh, it was India, and that's where my family is from. And Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs, we all lived together. Those were the three major religions. And for centuries, we lived in peace, relative peace. And then the British came, and they used sectarian differences of, language and religion and skin color, and started using that against the population in order to rule them, divide and conquer. But what ended up happening was that overnight, my father told me, people became enemies, that those divisions started to become so exacerbated that they woke up one day, literally it was almost like overnight, where neighbors started killing neighbors and no one was safe anymore. And when Pakistan was created in 1947, my father's side was in India, and they became part of, I guess in that time, I'm not sure if today it would still stand, the greatest human migration of its time, where people had to be moved by train. They would go and live in refugee camps, and then they would be put on trains, and then people would be moving both ways. Hindus who lived in what would now be Pakistan were moved to India, and Muslims who lived in India would be moved to Pakistan. And my father said it was the most traumatic thing, because those trains would be stopped sometimes and people would be slaughtered, like the entire trains would arrive with people who had been killed. And he lived through that. He was 15 years old. And he always tells me that transformed him, because he learned, because his family was relatively prosperous in India. They had land, they had jobs, they had security, and it just vanished. He goes, it just vanished overnight. Just everything disappeared. And suddenly we were in this new land with nothing, and we had to start all over again. But what happened was, he realized that if you're going to start all over again, then the one thing no one can take away from you is education. And he became obsessed with education. And he got scholarships, and he went to university, and he became a civil engineer. And in those days, once you became a civil engineer, the irony was that England was looking for civil engineers to help rebuild after World War II, and they actually allowed immediate immigration to come to England. And so my father was a civil engineer. He moved to the UK, and he began working in concrete construction, of all places. He lived in a place called Liverpool, and we have Liverpudlians. Have you guys heard of is it the Mersey Tunnel? The Massey Tunnel? There was a big concrete tunnel, right? And he was working on that tunnel, and it took years and years. He was doing the concrete testing. And in our culture, the eldest son is considered responsible for maintaining the family. Like, he has to work, and he has to take all the money, and he has to send it back to his parents, and they use the money to raise the rest of the children and educate them. And he did that. He was very dutiful. He sent his entire paycheck home, and he worked and worked. And I think he was in his mid-30s, and I think the villagers at home were like, what happens to him? Does he not have a life? Does he not have a chance, at his own future? And his parents were like, he refuses. He's so committed to raising his younger brothers and sisters, because he came from such a traumatic background that he feels that he has to do this. And he says, we can't get him to move on. And so one day he gets a telegram. For all the young people, before cell phones and even phones, long distance, you had to send a telegram, and you would have to go to a special office and read it. And in it said, "Father is very sick, possibly dying, please come home." And he hadn't been home in a decade. So he rushed back home, only to be greeted by a band and a wedding ceremony, which was his, by the way, and a brand new bride. And I guess it's what you call an arranged marriage, but more traditional or extreme, where you don't even know it's being arranged. And he was like, oh, and in those days you couldn't say no to your parents, right? That was it, you got married. And to be honest, I think it's a tradition we should revive, because I feel some of us who are having trouble getting our children married, I don't think it's a bad tradition anymore. Anyway, I digress. You can tell I have 4 unmarried children anyway. So he got married, and I guess family reunification was instantaneous in those days, in the early 60s. And he went back to England with his new wife. And a year later, They got married so quickly, you guys, that they didn't have chance for wedding photos, so they took a picture in England after they got married. and then a year later, yes, that is me. I was born. I am one of 3 children. I'm the eldest and the only daughter. And so my father became the sort of proto-feminist, because when he went back home, he realized that all of his female relatives had become married, and he had wanted them to go to university and get an education. And in those days, marrying a woman young was considered a way of security, keeping her safe at that time and place. But he became obsessed with the fact that marriage seemed to be the thing that held women back, marriage and babies. And every time he would meet a woman and he would say, what's your education? And she would say, oh, I have a BSc. And he'd go, well, why didn't you get your master's? And she'd like, oh, well, I got married and had children. Or if she had her master's, why didn't you get your PhD? And she said, well, I got married and had children. And if she had her PhD, why aren't you running the Economic Forum at, the UN? And she goes, I got married and had babies. So in his mind, it fused marriage and babies. Bad, right? Never let it happen to you. If you can, bypass that section of your life, your career will go through the roof. And as his only daughter, he taught me that. He's like, don't ever, that marriage is for women who have failed, right, in their lives, who couldn't do anything else. So that was like plan B. But if you, become, and what is the number one profession for immigrant dads, for their daughters? Medicine, yes, becoming a doctor. So that's what he taught me. He's like, you have to become a doctor. You will make a 6-figure salary. You will do whatever you want in this world. Never get married and have babies, because that was the one thing that'll stop you from your dreams. So I was like, okay, I'm a little kid. I'm drinking the Kool-Aid. Completely believed it. My mom didn't appreciate this advice, but she was too afraid to say anything, right? Because my father was like on this mission of me being a doctor. And I got great grades in high school. I was doing really well. Then I got to university, and I discovered the arts, English and literature, and there's this whole universe. But the thing with becoming a doctor is that they make you take organic chemistry and calculus and physics. And I just couldn't, you guys. I tried. I really did try, but I just didn't like them anymore. And I still remember to this day, the physics test was, I think it was, please calculate the internal circumference or surface area of a rotating cube. And first of all, I had no idea what they were even asking, right? And so I wrote an essay, and I said, does anyone really need to know this? I mean, what point, what are we really trying to do in the universe by learning how to calculate these things? And so I would answer these long, mathematical questions with essays. They did pass me, but with just a low enough grade that it prevented me from getting into medical school, because I think medical school realizes that there are people like me out there who have been forced by their fathers to go to medical school, but really don't want to, but don't understand they don't want to, and so they have boards who make sure that we don't accidentally end up treating people, right? And so, but the trouble was, you guys, I had a 4-year science degree when I applied to medical school, and then I got rejected. And I was like, wait, I have been raised from an embryo for only one purpose, to become a doctor. So I was like, I don't know. I remember having an existential crisis, going, I literally don't have any other career option. I don't know what else to do with my life. But my mother, who was waiting for plan B, she goes, I know, we'll get you married. And all of a sudden, you guys, there's this auntie network, right? They just phone, and it's like across North America, and suddenly they're like, I have an eligible daughter, what do you got? And I would come home, and there would be a fully formed man in the living room, and somehow, weirdly enough, they were all PhD candidates from Pakistan, and they all had this contract that they had signed with the government, where the government would pay for their PhDs in North America, but after they finished, they would have to go and do a couple of years of service, right? So I was meeting these men, and they're like, so you're okay about moving back to Karachi with me, right? And I was like, oh my God, if I don't pull it together with my career, I'm going to wind up as a housewife in Karachi, and that's it. That's what happens to me, right? And not that there's anything wrong with being a housewife in Karachi. I'm sure it's, there are lovely women out there who are housewives in Karachi, but I just felt that wasn't what I wanted to do with my life at that time. So I thought, okay, stop licking your wounds, figure it out. What can you do if you don't get into medical school? There has to be other careers, right, out there. And my best friend was always talking about being a filmmaker and writing novels, and I always thought, those were the sexy careers, for women who wore lip gloss and fishnet stockings and lived, fast lives, not for conservative Muslim women like me. But then, it was either that or being a housewife in Karachi. So I quickly, the only deadline that hadn't passed, it was called at that time Ryerson University, but they've changed their name to Metropolitan University. They had a journalism program, and the deadline hadn't passed. And so I quickly applied. And it's one of the most prestigious journalism programs in the country. And I got an interview. And I couldn't believe it. So I was thinking, what am I going to do? Like, people have spent their whole careers waiting for this interview. They have, they've written articles for newspapers, they have resumes, and I got maybe an article in my Islamic, newspaper from camp about dust or something, what am I going to do? And so I said, okay, go, I went in there and I was reading a magazine about women's issues. There was all these, Chatelaine, all these magazines, so I was reading them. And then this elderly man invites me in and he says, we decided to grant you an interview because every applicant who has come to us has a BA, and you are the only one with a science degree. And I said, you know what? I've always felt that people who write about science in newspapers and magazines should have a science background. So I said to myself, I'm going to prepare by getting a science degree. And he goes, that was so forthright of you. And I said, I know. And then he goes, tell me something that you would write about in science. And I was like, good God, because the only thing they ever taught us was about these rotating cubes, right? Which I always knew would come to no good. But then I had just read these magazines, and there was this article about Norplant. You would put it in your arm, and it would release hormones for birth control, and it was cutting edge. And I figured, he was elderly. His wife was probably menopausal. They probably weren't on the cutting edge of birth control. So I said, listen, there's this new thing that's just been invented, and you put it in a woman's arm, and it releases hormones. And it's this revolutionary new birth control method, and I think it should be in all the women's magazines. And he goes, so do I. We got to let you in so you can write about it. You guys, he let me in, and that's when I realized I can tell story, right? And make people believe things. And so I got into journalism school, and you know who my teacher was? Stuart McLean. Do people know who he is? Yes. For the younger people, he was one of the most renowned radio personalities we have, and he taught radio journalism at what was then Ryerson, and I was his student. And in his class, I made a radio documentary called The Changing Rituals of Death. And it was about how people wanted funerals that were different and more fun. Like, one guy wanted his casket, as it went down, he wanted a hand to spring out and say goodbye. And so I made this radio documentary, and it was submitted to the Ontario Telefest Awards, and it ended up winning the top journalism award. And so I went to the ceremony, and I was supposed to take a picture beside Stuart McLean. And I stood beside him, and then I felt a tapping on my shoulder, and I turned around, it was my mother. And she goes, oh, no. You can't take a picture with Stuart McLean, because if a picture with you and a white man gets out, then rumors will spread that you've had an affair with him, and I'll never be able to marry you, right? And I was like, I had to move away from him, and someone else had to take the spot, and I was so mad. 20 years later, Stuart McLean came to Regina for his Vinyl Cafe tour, and I went, and I talked to the guard that was guarding him, and I told him the whole sob story. I go, please, let me in to the green room. And he let me in, You guys, I got my picture. And then I sent it to my mom. And she's like, I don't care. You're married now. You're your husband's problem, right? Which is obviously like a revenge to your Pakistani conservative mother you could never do. Once you're, they'll always get their last laugh. So I want, the person who won that award got a 6-month placement at CBC Radio. And here's another name, with Peter Zosky from Morningside. And for those who don't know, who are young, he was like the Gomeshi of his time, but without the weird sexual stuff, He was the #1 radio host in Canada, and his show, Morningside, had higher ratings than even television shows. He was so renowned. And he was known for putting magic on air, interviewing people and just creating magic. And I was one of those people who would interview people. What I would do is I would interview people, come up with questions, and then give it to him, and then he would make this magic on air. And that's when I realized that it was Peter that was having the most fun and was enjoying himself, and I was starting to I felt this creative energy inside of myself, and it wasn't being met with journalism. I realized I didn't know enough about the arts at the time when I applied to realize that I probably should have applied to film instead of journalism. But now I had a 2-year degree. I had a 4-year degree in science, a 2-year degree in journalism, and I said to myself, how do I know I could become a filmmaker? Like, how do I know? And someone said, I don't want to do another 4-year degree in filmmaking. And they said, well, take a summer film workshop at the Ontario College of Art. It's just 3 weeks. And you'll make a 5-minute film, and then you'll find out if you have what it takes to be a storyteller in the film medium. So I took the class, and so it was really interesting. So you put in groups of like 4 or 5 students. One of you is the writer-director, then you've got the sound person and the DP, and so you've got a whole camera crew, and you went out. And so I was thinking to myself, what could I make a film about? And just then, there was this incident that happened in the United States that covered all the newspapers, the Oklahoma bombing of 1995. It was, at that time, the biggest domestic terror incident in the United States. The Alfred P. Murrah building was a federal building, and it had blown up. And immediately people said it's Muslim terrorists. And I remember that day, the Toronto Star had been redesigned, and on the cover were all these pictures of Muslims. And they said, one of these men has done it. And they were arresting Muslims and removing them and interrogating them. And I think it was literally 2 or 3 days later, Timothy McVeigh was arrested. And he had blown up the building because he was very angry at the American government for the mishandling of the David Koresh case. And he was trying to get revenge on the American government, and he was trying to decide between assassinating a political leader or blowing up a federal building. And he chose to blow up a federal building with hundreds of people died, including there was a daycare and children. And I thought to myself, wow, like the whole issue of white nationalism and white supremacy and white terrorism hadn't even been touched in the media. People had been so obsessed with Muslims and the stereotypes of Muslims that they had missed this whole other story. So I thought to myself, I wonder if I could make a film about that. So I wrote a short film called Barbecue Muslims, and it was about two Muslim brothers who were sleeping in their backyard one night, and their barbecue gets blown up. And they're immediately accused of being Middle Eastern terrorists. But the thing is, the actual people who blew up their barbecue were the Barbecue Anti-Resistant Front, because they were convinced that barbecues were releasing carbon dioxide and were causing climate change. They were a little bit ahead of their time, and so they couldn't get people to pay attention to their cause, so they thought they would take it up a notch and blow up people's barbecues. It was working until they accidentally blew up a Muslim person's barbecue. And then they arrested the Muslims for being terrorists. And the Muslims are like, we don't even know what's going on with the barbecue. Maybe it malfunctioned. We don't understand why it blew up. And so the terrorist group is like protesting in front of the police officer in the building, saying it was us, it was us. And one guy is arguing with the other guy, going, why would you blow up a Muslim's barbecue? And he's like, listen, we go into backyards, We see barbecues. They're not labeled about, they're not ecumenically labeled. We don't know which religious group owns the barbecue. We just blow it up. We didn't know that it was a Muslim family that owned this barbecue. And so I wrote and directed this film, and my brother was in it. I got my neighborhood to act as the actors, and it was kind of sloppy and not well done, but I thought it deserved an Oscar. So I submitted it to the Toronto International Film Festival. And then a couple of months later, I get a very irate phone call from the organizer. And he's like, listen, first of all, you have the nerve to submit this to us. And then you don't even put your name and phone, I put my name but not my phone number. And I had moved to Saskatchewan at that time, so they had to call all the Nawazes in the southern Saskatchewan region until they got my brother, who told them I had moved to Saskatchewan and he had given the forwarding number. And then he goes, we are forced to program this film. There are people who will be looking at us saying, there were technically superior films with real actors, and then there's this. But we cannot deny the fact that we have never seen someone make a comedy about terrorism. And of course, I was like appalled, because this was my serious opus, right, about terrorism. And I'm like, this isn't a comedy, right? This is a very serious, philosophical film about being stereotyped. But then I saw it being aired when it was shown at the Toronto Film Festival, and people were laughing. And I was sort of like, I think I made a comedy by mistake. And then that was what started my career. So those were the three terrorists who were fighting about, they're picketing in front of the police officers. That's my brother in the middle, and the neighborhood. And then at the bottom was I was making fun of how the Toronto Star had pictures of Muslims. So that kind of weirdly launched my career. And I'm like, oh, I can make films, and they seem to be funny, and they seem to be political. And so the Toronto International Film guy was like, listen, we'll allow you to get away with this one time, but I expect for your next film, proper casting of real actors, a real crew, like something that's done properly. We only let this go one time. So because I had gotten into the Toronto International Film Festival, it's considered your calling card film, which now means that you can now apply. If you're not a filmmaker in Canada, it's all about the applications. It's paperwork. 90% of it is paperwork, filling out forms. And so I filled out the form, and I put Toronto International Film Festival in my form, which meant that I now had made a calling card film, and I could get more funding. So I cobbled together about $30,000, because in those days, today we have video, but in those days it was actual film, and film is expensive to buy and then to process and to edit. And I thought to myself, what could I do my next film on? And all the media was obsessed with, remember that whole Salman Rushdie case? Young people don't know about this, but there was a case in Iran where Salman Rushdie, an author who had been sentenced to death by Khomeini, the leader of Iran, and people were obsessed with Muslims and fatwas of death and telling us that that's all we cared about was sentencing people to death. And there was a whole story that people were ignoring the political background of what was happening in Iran at the time and how this was being used as a smokescreen for other things. But I thought, how can I get people to see that, constantly calling Muslims terrorists and being obsessed with fatwas of death for writers, and get them to see through that? And so I came up with a film called Death Threat, and it was about a Muslim woman who writes a really bad, schlocky romance novel, and she can't get it published. And so she decides to exploit the stereotypes of Muslims being terrorists. And so she tries to get a Muslim to sentence her to death. And so she goes out and she, vandalizes the mosque, and she, does all sorts of terrible things to her community. And they're like, we can get you some help. You tell us what's wrong. You want to, you seem very aggrieved, and she's realizing they're not going to sentence her to death. So she's like, oh, I've got to write my own death sentence. So she writes her own death sentence, and she just needs someone authentic to sign it, right? A $3 million bounty on her head. She goes, who can sign it? And then she reads in the newspaper that a member of the Hamas is coming to give a lecture at the university. Only men are invited. And she goes, this is perfect. I'll go there and I'll get them to sign it. And so she dresses up, very conservatively. She goes to the talk, and then she reads the sign, and she realizes that she had misread it, and it's not a meeting of the Hamas, it's a cooking class for hummus for men who don't know how to cook. And so she's like, oh no, like, I need to get my death sentence signed. And so the chickpea delivery man comes, and so she hands him the death sentence, and he thinks he's signing for the chickpeas, and he signs the death threat. And the next thing she knows, she's getting all this media attention, but the only people who want to kill her are the Saskatchewan farmers because they've had a bad yield. And this is so great because this makes up for the government lack of subsidies, right? And so this turned out to be a Saskatchewan wheat farming story, but the twist being it was called Death Threat. Sorry, that's really small, but that was a story about Salman Rushdie. So that I submitted to the Toronto International Film Festival, and they said, good, finally, you've written a film that had real actors and a real cast, and it was professionally done. And so I was making kooky films for a while. I was starting to do. I did a film called Random Check, which was about Muslims going to the airports and continually getting random checked. And I had a comedy about a Muslim man who's on his way to his wedding, and he's late, and he gets random checked. And he tries to explain to his fiancée that he's going to be late because he's been put in jail. And so she thinks that he's getting cold feet and just doesn't want to marry her, and he's just making this up, right? And he's in jail, and he's like, no, I'm going to lose my bride and my wedding and everything because I got random checked. And he goes, how am I going to get out of here? And then his fellow prisoner has one arm, because at the time I realized I had watched a documentary that if you give yourself if you're a drug user and you give yourself too many needles, you can risk amputation. And so he had a one-armed friend. And then a Canadian documentary team comes into the prison to document whether or not Canadian prisoners are being treated properly, as is, an NFB production. and so he decides this is perfect. So he pretends to be a really angry terrorist, and he says, and the Canadian government doesn't even feed us properly in the prisons. I had to eat his arm to survive, right? And then you see the Canadian head of, chefs in prisons eating his food, going, how dare my reputation be besmirched in this way? We serve prisoners shrimp and steak, in the typical Canadian fashion. He goes, I am launching in an inquiry, right? And then an inquiry is launched, and then you realize this man had been imprisoned improperly, and that's how he was released. And so I was making fun of government inquiries and random checks. And then I did the obsession. I don't know if you guys remember, but this was an obsession a few years ago with the Harper government. Muslim women wearing niqab. It became a big political divisive issue in our election. And I wanted to make fun of it. And it was about a guy whose loan shark is after him. Like he owes his loan shark a lot of money, and he doesn't have money to repay him. And the loan shark is coming to to beat him up, and he's trying to escape. And he looks out the window, and luckily enough, he lives next door to a neighbor who wears niqab. And he goes, oh my God, this is perfect. And so he puts on the niqab and the robes, and he runs to the nearest 7-Eleven because he wants to hold it up for money so he can play his loan shark. But when he gets there, there's a lovely Indian man who assumes this is a woman who has come, and he can't get the gun out of his robes because they're so big. And so he's just kind of going like this, and the young man who's running the 7-Eleven thinks the man, this is a woman proposing to him for marriage, and he accepts. And then, so this guy is like, I'm not going to be able to get money from the 7-Eleven, so he runs home, but then the loan shark is waiting for him, right? But he left his slipper in the 7-Eleven. And the young man who saw the slipper like Cinderella follows him and sees his beloved getting beaten up by the loan shark and rescues his supposed wife. Anyway, I know it was really kooky, so I made it was called Fred's Burqa. But then at that time, the National Film Board rescued me, and they said, listen, we know that you can make really kooky stories about kooky subjects. We get it, right? But why don't you do something like more serious, like something that matters to you? And I remember at that time, I was praying in the mosque, and sort of conservative men had come and put like a curtain in front of us. And I realized that people were mixing up theology with tradition. And I wanted to do a documentary saying that, there's nothing in Islam that says that women have to be praying behind a curtain, and this is something that has been sort of imported here, and we need to talk about this as Muslims, and we need to go back to the original sources and see, during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, women and men prayed in the same areas without separation, and women were able to speak up and stand and complain if their rights were taken away. And I said today how hard, if we keep this up with the separation of curtains in front of women, we won't be able to have that. And we need to bring back that equality in our mosques that we had, in centuries ago. So what I did was I used patriarchy to my side. I went to this Islamic conference in Toronto that had just started, Reviving the Islamic Spirit. For those who don't know, it's an annual convention. It's massive. But I went the first year they did it when they were very innocent and unsuspecting. And so they would, because I didn't have the budget to go to all these different countries and find scholars. So it was literally like a conference like this, and then I had like a room over there, and when this scholar would finish speaking, they would leave the room and have to pass me. And then I would grab them with my camera crew and put them there. That's Dark Suedan. He's like a famous scholar. And I would say, listen, what do you think about this issue about women being put behind curtains? And they would say, no, there's no sanction for this in our religion. Women and men should be able to have equal access to the prayer space. And so I interviewed all these scholars, and I made a documentary called Me in the Mosque. And when that came out, the National Film Board sent me to Banff Television Festival that happens every year. It's happening, I think, in about the middle of June. And I said to my friend, I go, what do people do at Banff? And my friend said, well, normally when people go to Banff, they pitch television shows. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I've never pitched a television show before. And I had just come off of this documentary, and I thought, and the concept in my mind was, what if there was an imam that was born and raised in Canada? And what if he had left his law practice behind, and he decided to run a mosque because he felt that was his true calling? How would that affect the politics of a mosque? How would the women feel? How would the men feel? What if he was a little non-traditional, didn't have a beard? What would it change the dynamics of the community? And so I came up with the concept for a little mosque on the prairie, and I pitched it. And I think at that time, we didn't have a lot of success in the world of sitcoms in Canada, right? We had like King of Kensington and Beachcombers. Those were the two of the biggest national hits. And there was just this sense in Canada that we just didn't have what it took to make like huge national hits the way the Americans did. Part of the problem was that we also didn't have the ad dollars because we're an English-speaking nation, and the U.S. is, we're 30 million, the U.S. is 300 million, so our television shows were getting obliterated by their ads, and Canadians were essentially unaware that these shows existed. But then when I pitched this show, the CB said, they said, yeah, we'd like to develop it. But then news started to leak into the U.S. that they're making a show about Muslims, and it's not even going to be like a family comedy. It's a comedy set in a mosque, and Muslims don't have a sense of humor, and they're going to blow up the CBC. So suddenly, we were being inundated with the New York Times and CNN and Al Jazeera. Everyone was coming up to interview us while we were shooting the show. And what we got were like millions and millions and millions of ad dollars that we couldn't afford through these advertisements. And then the Canadian media suddenly woke up and they're like, what's happening in Canada? Like, they're making a show. And so when we aired the first episode, we had the highest ratings since Anne of Green Gables had premiered on CBC 20 years earlier, right? And then Corner Gas came out at the same time. Two shows that came out of Saskatchewan were the two biggest hits. I know, right? Two of the biggest hits that the country had seen, and they were national hits. And it promoted the entire industry and gave the industry the sense that we could do it, that we had what it took to make a national, two national shows that could capture the attention of the country. But what was interesting for me, was that the show was going around the world via YouTube at that time. People, because this is before the streaming services like Disney Plus and Amazon Prime, and the producers had released it on YouTube, and people around the world were watching, and suddenly I started getting all these calls from European journalists. And they were very confused. They were like, how is it that, like, you can have a show like this? And I'm like, what do you mean? And they're like, well, Muslims and non-Muslims living together in the same city, you know, you guys seem like you're similar in education and jobs. And I'm like, yeah, what, I don't understand. And that's when I realized that there was a very different process of immigration history in Europe than there was in Canada. And then someone explained to me, they said, for example, in Germany, when they were trying to rebuild, they brought in temporary foreign workers from Turkey with the idea that they would never stay and were not meant to stay, or the country didn't want them to stay. So they were housed on the outskirts and in what would eventually become ghettos. And people thought they would only be there for 10, 15 years, but they were there for generations. They weren't given citizenship, so then their children couldn't go to university. So a permanent underclass developed. And there was no movement. Their kids couldn't go up the stratosphere. In the way that I was able to go to university, become a journalist, become a filmmaker, and have a career, the children of Turkish immigrants were not, because they lived far away. They didn't have access to education or jobs or employment. And so millions and millions of people were like this, who this went on for generations. And so the rates of unemployment were high, the rates of crime were high. And countries like France, they took away Muslim women's right to wear hijab in school. So if you went to university or high school, you couldn't. You would be removed. And there were some cases where even if they dressed modestly with long skirts, they were removed from school. This is similar to what Quebec is doing for Muslim women. For Muslim women who wear hijab, they cannot have jobs in the federal government. I think there was recently a law passed about praying in schools. And so what was happening was that in many ways their culture and their faith and the way they could practice was being taken away, and any way of upward mobility was taken away. And so people didn't view Muslims as, regular people of society. They viewed them as a problem, an underclass. So when the show came out, they were like, we don't understand, how is it that those issues haven't come to pass in your country? And that was when I started to think about my own life and the trajectory it had as a conservative Muslim woman who prayed and wore hijab as a younger woman, that I never faced those obstacles in the way, had my father moved to Germany or France, I would have turned out to be a very different person. And so it taught me a lesson about the value of how we integrate minorities and immigrants, and how we give them the freedom to practice their faith, and their culture and live their lives, and how that freedom allows people to thrive, and what happens in a country when that is not allowed to happen. I mean, it's not a perfect analogy, but like similar things happened. What happened to the Muslims in Europe, in some level, was similar to what happened to the indigenous people in Canada in terms of not being allowed to practice their culture, speak their language. I mean, it wasn't exactly the same, but the devastation of what happens to a community is what had happened in Europe. And so that taught me a really valuable lesson, that what we were sending out to the world was this other model of integration and community involvement. And what I learned from that was that organizations like yourselves are critical to that integration, because if you don't do that, Canada is a very fortunate country, but it's also a country that has to be careful, because when you have a country with different languages and different faiths and different belief systems, and we all learn to live together, it's a very delicate balance, and sometimes governments and politicians will use our differences for cheap political gain. And that can cause devastation in a country, because I am here because India, fell apart and started killing people because of sectarian violence, because the colonialist power started using the differences of religion to divide people. And although we live here together in relative peace, that peace is a really fragile web, and can disappear like that. And if you talk to people from Rwanda or the former Yugoslavia, they'll tell you, how quickly civil society can disintegrate when you exacerbate the differences of human beings. And so I always like to end my talk in saying that I believe that it's really important for people like myself to talk about our stories and to talk about how we came here and what our messages are. And I like to talk about it through comedy. I wrote two books. One was trying to explain to people what it's like to grow up as a young immigrant woman with really conservative parents, and yet using that conservatism to thrive and to grow. And I call it Laughing All the Way to the Mosque, because I feel like people need to realize that these are happy stories. And because we always focus on the negative, and we always act as if those are bad things to be a conservative religious person. To me, it was a thing that really helped me grow as a person. And I feel like those are the stories that we need to talk about. And then I wrote a book called Jamila Green Ruins Everything, and I wanted to talk about American foreign policy and how war in the world, particularly in Syria and Iraq, had caused such devastation, and why, because a lot of times when you hear Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or ISIS, you think, oh, Muslims and terrorists, but you don't realize all the political backstory that happened that had caused these organizations to form in the first place. They don't just come out of nowhere. There are very particular circumstances, which result in power vacuums. But then the stereotypes of violence in Muslims grows out of that and then comes and affects communities here. And then we can see problematic issues like women not being allowed to go to school if they wear hijab because, that's too much of a religious thing. So I think what I view as my job and my responsibility is to talk to people about my story, but talk to people in a way that's digestible, that's funny, that's engaging, so that we can talk to each other as people at the same level. Because every one of you has a mom, like my mom, who's probably telling you that you're not raising your kids right. Why are your kids still single? Why do you talk to 400 people and you still can't find a husband for your daughters? And it's so funny because one time she actually FaceTimed me and I, showed everyone, and she was complaining to the audience. She's like, "Can you believe this? She's so many people that one of you can find her husband." And I feel like this is the way to connect on a human level, because what I learned from making Little Mosque on the Prairie was, the CBC kept saying, give us more Muslim-y things, give us more Muslim-y details. But after a while, those are superficial things, the holidays, the clothes, the food. And then you run out of those type of stories, and then you realize people are just people. And we all have the exact same problems, the exact same, the patriarch, the matriarch, the bossy, the teenager, the person who thinks they should run the community, the person who thinks they know it all. Those people are universal, and they exist in every community. And the more specific you root your story, the more universal it becomes and the more people can relate to your story. And that is why I've decided that, I wanted at first to become a doctor, but I felt like really my calling was to become a storyteller and to talk to the world about these issues, because at the end of the day, it's the very fabric of our societies that depends on these stories, because the stories are what link us as human beings and will keep us safe and will make us live in peace and prosperity. And I can talk forever, as you can tell. I don't even know if my time is up. I was given an hour. Is it up? What time is it now? Oh my gosh, okay, sorry. 1 minute over. I was gonna ask people if they had any questions, but I guess I'll be signing books outside, but if anyone has questions, I can answer them then. I feel the organizers would not appreciate it if I suddenly, I think I'm finished. Yeah, that's good. This way or that way, right? Okay.
Thank you, Zarqa. Thank you, Zarqa.